In light of a growing amount of support for menopausal women at work, two advocates for gender equality in the workplace are calling for a shift of focus towards other areas of female health. Women's health expert Clare-Louise Knox and HR consultant Kate Wright think that it's time for Jersey to start talking about periods. They're calling on islanders to start the conversation at work in order to eliminate the stigma surrounding female health issues. This, they argue, is the first step towards achieving gender equality in the workplace. I'm Jodie Ettram, and this is Bailiwick Podcasts. So today I've got two very knowledgeable women here to talk to me about how we can create a more supportive and inclusive work environments for women and for those who have periods in the workplace. Claire and Kate are experts in sort of supporting women's menstrual health in the workplace and in promoting diversity and inclusion across various organisations. So if you could first introduce yourself, Claire, and then Kate, if you could tell me a bit more about your role in the island.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. Absolutely. So I'm Claire. I am an organisational psychologist and I focus on female health in the workplace. And I'm the founder of a company called See Her Thrive, and we work to really level the playing field for women and to make work better, more accessible, more inclusive for people who have periods, menstrual cycles, go through menopause, undergo fertility treatment, experience pregnancy loss, issues with maternity, all of the things that we can go through during our life course. We're helping to redress the balance and make sure workplaces have the knowledge, the awareness and the tools ultimately to support the female workforce.
And Kate, if you could explain a bit more about your role within the island and sort of how you've been taking on some of Claire's ideas to better support workplaces in Jersey.
I'm Kate. I'm an HR consultant and cultural change specialist. By profession, my passion project is the Diversity Network, which is a not-for-profit campaign group, really, that was established 6 years ago in Jersey. And we aim to work with employers to improve diversity and equity, inclusion, a sense of belonging in our workplaces. But increasingly, we have been sort of working, across the community in Jersey on some of these issues, and with government too. One of our most high-profile campaigns was working with Claire actually, and Julia Warrender, a local businesswoman in Jersey, the 51 Employers Pledge, which is a sort of 14-point framework that is designed for any employer of any industry size and to pick up and help them. It's a tool to help them create a more menopause friendly workplace. And the response to that locally was amazing, actually. I think we have around 80 employers signed up to it currently.
Thanks so much for sort of telling me a bit more about all the amazing work you've been doing. I've recently become interested in this topic about learning more about our hormonal cycles as women and how these differ to men, and how this impacts our energy levels and our emotional and physical well-being at different times of the month. And I never really realised the extent to which this impacts us, because it's never really taught to us. Claire, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the different phases of our menstrual cycle. And I've heard this sort of be referred to as seasons, so maybe one of the seasons is our summer, one is our autumn. I don't know if you've heard of this framework or if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I would say to anyone listening is think about what changes you've noticed about your own cycle and maybe tune into that, and just as a bit of an experiment for a couple of cycles, just track how your mood, your energy, your productivity, creativity, all of those things, just track how they change, how they fluctuate, because one thing that I think is really, really important in this context is our individual experience and differences. And unfortunately, we are conditioned into thinking there's a textbook cycle, if you like, that's 28 days, and we have these very neat phases, and we're going to feel one way at one point and another way at another point. And there are so many individual differences that isn't always right. So that's one thing I would encourage everyone to do, first of all. But if we just zoom out and generalize a little bit and look at the menstrual cycle, what's happening, I'm not going to use seasons because I don't like that approach. I like to use the proper language and the proper scientific terminology. So I'm sorry, anybody who likes using spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but that's not my bag at all. So we have our menstrual phase, which is from day one of when we have our bleed or our period, whatever you like to call it. And many of us, I'm sure, will resonate with pain, perhaps feeling low energy, being, preferring to not do very much, maybe not being as productive as we usually are during that kind of phase in our cycle. And we might want to adapt the way we are looking after ourselves. Maybe we change the way we're exercising, and just focus on rest, recuperation, to do what our body's telling us to do, really. Then we move on to our follicular phase, which is the first or the stage before ovulation. And in that part of the cycle, we see estrogen gradually increasing, or our levels start to rise. And estrogen has many, many benefits and influences in the body and on the brain. It can help us to feel really good in terms of our mood. It can give us energy. It can make us more productive. Studies even show that the closer we get to ovulation, we're more confident, we're more articulate, we're more sociable. And so there is the science to show that we do experience these shifts across our cycle. When we get to ovulation, we've got big hormonal surges happening to prepare a follicle to release an egg. And that, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, we're taught that ovulation is the time when we're feeling at our best, when everything is brilliant, we're really feeling confident and attractive and sociable and all of those positive things. But what I would say is, for lots of people with different conditions like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, even things like endometriosis, ovulation can be a really tricky time because of those hormonal fluctuations that are happening. And so it isn't always a positive thing for us. And that's why I think that individual lens is super, super important. Then we move into the luteal phase, where progesterone becomes the dominant hormone and takes over. And progesterone has a very, very different effect on the body compared to estrogen. It's soothing. It has this kind of sedating effect. It's very calming. And we might find that we become more introspective. We go into ourselves a bit more. We're less sociable. But again, for some people who have a sensitivity to progesterone, the closer we get to our period, we might find that we experience negative symptoms associated with those increasing levels of progesterone. So low mood, low energy, bloating, migraines. There's a whole host of symptoms associated with premenstrual syndrome and PMDD. That I think is the 4 phases of the cycle, and what we might experience.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. I really like the way you advocate for an individual lens for looking at this, because obviously all women are different. We all have very different experiences that are affected by things like, whether we have a menstrual condition or not. I just wanted to ask, why do you think using the correct scientific language is so important? How does that fit into the conversation?
When we don't use the correct terminology, so when we're referring to, let's take a vulva as an example, when we're teaching young people that they've got a flower or they've got a fufu, and they grow up and they don't know what a vulva is, and they don't know the difference between a vagina and a vulva, and it exacerbates the stigma. We don't need to trivialize these things. We don't need to use different language to dress it up. It is what it is, and so I really do care about using the proper terminology, because I think if we don't, we're just feeding into everything we're trying to undo. Kate, I don't know what you think about it.
No, it's really interesting what you say. I'm 47, and I think back through my life as a menstruating young woman and mature women, and some of the language and the stigma that was attached. I remember at school, it was very hush hush. Quite a bit of excitement when you got your first period amongst the girls, but it was time of the month, and that's all it was. And I remember having a friend who really struggled with period pain, and would end up having a couple of days off each month. And I remember her getting into trouble. The form teacher taking her aside and saying, you can't have time off because of your time of the month. You've got to pull yourself together. And there was no sort of medical understanding, and compassion as a result. And she was, you just got to get on with it, put up with it. That is not an excuse. As an HR manager, again, women finding themselves being in a disciplinary situation because they were taking too much time off because of their periods. That's not an excuse. And then, funny things, when I was at I had a boyfriend at university, and I found his diary. I probably shouldn't have been snooping in his diary. And he'd marked down one Tuesday a month, he'd put in the diary as Weepy Tuesday. And I'm like, what's Weepy Tuesday? And he said, well, that's when you have your period and you're in pain and you're really annoying and grumpy. I'm like, there was such a stigma attached. It's such a sort of stereotype there about, just because I might have been grumpy on a few Tuesdays, it must be her time in the month. And that is the symptoms that, that women get within. And I actually probably just had a terrible relationship. I blame him entirely for Weepy Tuesdays. But that's the kind of language. It's a joke. It's a stereotype, not to be taken seriously. I completely see through my own experiences how not using and understanding the sort of correct medical terminology and what it really means for women's health is really harmful, actually. And I mentioned the HR experience, but people actually potentially losing their jobs because there was no understanding of periods as a medical condition. And
I wonder, maybe Claire, if you could explain a bit more about menstrual conditions like maybe endometriosis, and I think it was PMDD that you mentioned. Just briefly, sort of what are they and how might they affect you in the workplace?
There are a whole host of different medical conditions directly linked to the menstrual cycle. So if we take endometriosis, first of all, it's so common. It affects around 1 in 10 females of reproductive age. It's likely to be more than that because we know that it's massively underdiagnosed and it takes years, decades in some cases to actually get a diagnosis. But what happens with endometriosis is the cells that are usually found on the inside of the uterus will grow outside of the uterus and attach themselves to other parts of the body, so places like the bladder, the intestines, the fallopian tubes, the ovaries. Those cells behave in a very, very similar way to the cells on the inside of the uterus. So they fill with blood and they contract. And so if you imagine the pain and the inflammation that can cause, particularly there are different stages of the disease, if we're going to call it a disease. stage 1 to stage 4. Now, if someone has stage 4 endometriosis, it means they've got lots of these lesions that are causing, debilitating pain and symptoms. And when we're getting to that end of the spectrum, we're talking about a disability, really, because the pain and the interference in everyday life can be so significant. People go to A&E, they go to hospital because the pain from a flare-up can be so excruciating. And then, we haven't even talked about the treatment and the process for diagnosis, which is incredibly invasive. It requires surgery at the moment to make a definitive diagnosis, which again, going through that and then recovering and having to take time off work and having to explain that, and the other person doesn't know what endo is and hasn't got a clue, and really complex situation. So that's endometriosis. PMDD, very different, but also linked to the menstrual cycle. So people with PMDD, and I include myself in this, I live with PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So we talked about how our hormones change during the menstrual cycle. Well, for people with PMDD, we have an abnormal reaction or a very, very heightened sensitivity to those hormone changes. So when we experience these peaks and these drops in hormone levels, it can trigger a whole host of symptoms. And that ranges, it's different for every person, just like endo symptoms vary between each individual. But for PMDD to be diagnosed, there does have to be the presence of psychological symptoms. And it's actually medically recognised as a mental health condition to give you a sense of the impact and how it presents. And so a lot of us will experience a real shift in our mood. We'll go from being our normal selves, inverted commas, if you like, to being this depressed, hopeless, pessimistic, unhappy version of ourselves that is unrecognisable. And it might be that we experience chronic fatigue. We're unable to function as we normally do in the time from ovulation leading up to our period. So we have this luteal phase usually where we notice this really significant change in ourselves, and then our period arrives and everything goes back to normal. When those hormone fluctuations settle down, everything kind of just returns to some kind of equilibrium, and then you spend the next 2 weeks undoing the damage that you've done, picking up the pieces, trying to recover things and prepare yourself for it all to happen again, because it's cyclical and there's a rhythm to it. So that's PMDD.
These are obviously huge issues potentially in the workplace for women experiencing these conditions. It must have a huge impact on your productivity and your well-being. Kate, I was just wondering, given your HR background, how might you think these could be addressed by an employer? It's quite a big question, but do you have any ideas of how a workplace could create a more supportive and inclusive environment for those experiencing these symptoms?
I think, first of all, you've got to remove the stigma attached to talking about these health issues. Mm-hmm. We should be able to talk about them in the same way as we do, other sort of physical health conditions. I don't think we can expect our line managers all to be, experts in PMDD and endometriosis, but we do need to create the kind of environment where, our line managers, hopefully an individual can, feel comfortable to go to their line manager or their HR, whoever it might be, and say, look, I'm really struggling at the moment and this is why. And then, that person is equipped to provide them with the support that they need in the workplace, whether that's, some time off or whether that's flexibility. to be able to signpost them to professionals, working in the community who can give them expert medical advice. So it's about creating that environment where there isn't a stigma attached, that you don't have to whisper, period pain or whatever it might be. You can have that conversation without fear that you're going to be stigmatized yourself as a woman in the workplace. And I think we're probably quite a long way from that in a lot of organisations still. I mean, the other thing is that we're equipping our line managers to be able to spot when someone's struggling. We've talked about it a lot from a mental health and well-being point of view over the last few years and made real progress. This doesn't just include women with menstrual health concerns. It covers employers with all sorts of issues that might be going on. It's about enabling our line managers to spot when somebody is struggling, isn't themselves, and being able to say, are you okay? Have that sensitive conversation and then, sort of together work out the kind of support they might need. So it's that cultural change that we need to see. And increasingly we're seeing organisations bring in menopause policies, for example, which is great, but a menopause policy alone is just a piece of paper or just a section on your intranet. That alone isn't going to change things. It's a cultural shift. So getting people like Claire in to give a talk, normalising the language, referring back to the point about using medical terms, I think that helps. Because we're placing it very firmly in the arena of a medical condition. It makes it easier for us to understand why we need to be supportive and why people might need some extra help. It's about changing that culture. And as I say, sadly, I think we're quite a long way off from achieving that in most organisations.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's to do with driving change surrounding the culture and surrounding the language, and not just, using these issues as just a tick box exercise. It's important to actually educate yourself, especially if you're a man and you don't understand any of these issues. It's important to, have these conversations, educate yourself, and then take steps to sort of reduce the stigma. I think that's probably like the first step and one of the main issues. I went to an all-girls school, and you'd be so embarrassed to have like a tampon. You'd like hide it under your arm, and it's just like it's incredible how stigmatized periods have become, given it affects half of the population. And I do think we are sort of making change to address this and to raise awareness. And one thing that you both have worked on, not directly in relation to that, but in relation to the menopause, has been the 51 Employers Pledge. Kate, I wonder if you could tell me a bit more about that pledge and what it means to support women going through the menopause.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting journey, actually. It started as the Diversity Network brought Claire in, actually, to run a webinar just after COVID. So going back a couple of years now on menopause, and we've been hoping to do something for a long time. I couldn't believe the response to this webinar. It was a free webinar, but the place is filled within 2 days of it going live on Eventbrite. Wow. And I thought, wow, there's a real need here. Really brilliant, insightful webinar from Claire. And through the discussions in that webinar, it became apparent that there's this lack of understanding, lack of support, the stigma still attached to menopause, and particularly in our workplaces. So as a result of that, Julia, Claire and I established a sort of online menopause cafe. And again, every month it was very informal. It was just a space for people to come and share their experiences, their stories, seek advice. We weren't giving medical advice. It was more about sharing stories and supporting each other. Those menopause cafes were really popular. And yet again, the sort of issue that, workplace was coming through as a really big barrier for women in terms of how they were coping with perimenopause and menopause, and being able to seek support and continue, to work in the way they've been used to working, fear that they were going to be demoted, lose their jobs, or would have to leave the workplace because there just wasn't that understanding there. So I think it was actually Julia's idea initially that actually we needed a tool to help employers, and it needed to be something that really started a very high-profile conversation in Jersey around menopause, so that we made it something that people were happy to talk about. That it wasn't this, something that happens to women at a certain age. It was perimenopause, menopause, and to start sort of taking away that stigma more generally. So Claire was the architect, as with everything she does, very much based on the sort of medical theory and her practical experience as well as a professional in this sphere. Came up with our sort of 14-point pledge. And it's a really simple framework, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, that any employer can pick up and implement. And by implementing those 14 points, they really start to sort of chip away at the stigma. They make menopause something that's okay for people to talk about. Not just providing support for people struggling with perimenopausal symptoms and menopause themselves, but their partners. The number of men who, I've now run quite a lot of talk in local organisations about the pledge, and the number of men that come along and want to understand and learn more is brilliant. And I think that's a really important point, because it can be hard for partners too. So it wasn't about a tick box exercise. We weren't going in and auditing progress. It was about creating lots of noise and lots of conversation, and improving understanding about menopause in order to create those more inclusive workplaces. The fact that I think it's around 80 employers have signed up across a range of industries is really demonstrates the need. Mm-hmm. I think, we were helped too at the time, very high-profile celebrities talking openly about their experiences. Davina McCall being the really famous one. I think that helped. It was quite a fashionable topic, and I don't think we've seen that in the same way as when we talk about other sort of menstrual health issues, and we need a lot more of that. People normalising it. Taking away that stigma.
Exactly. The conversation, it's been amazing that we're having more conversations about the menopause, and real work is being done to improve and address the associated issues and remove the stigma. But there is still more to be done in terms of actually, helping menstrual health in its other forms. But Claire, I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more about what the menopause actually is and what perimenopause is, and just a little bit more of an explanation surrounding that.
Yeah, absolutely. So perimenopause is the period of time where our hormone levels start to fluctuate and gradually decline as our ovarian function, or our natural ability to reproduce, if you like, runs out. So I think of it as, your ovaries going into retirement. And that usually, and I'm generalising, that usually starts to happen from our mid-30s. So around our mid-30s, we'll see our levels of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone gradually start to decline. But while they're doing this, they're fluctuating, and it's akin to puberty. When you look at what's happening behind the scenes hormonally, these fluctuations can be really wild. So that's why it can feel like a really turbulent time. It's disorientating. You see these changes, these symptoms cropping up, spanning physical, cognitive, psychological. Many of us think, what the hell is going on? Like, am I losing my marbles? It can be a really, and I'm saying that lightly, but it can be a really tricky time for lots of us. And about 25% of women report having very severe experiences when they're going through perimenopause. So this is the time leading up to menopause. Well, what's menopause? Menopause is an event, which sounds bizarre, but it's 365 days after we've had our last period. So if it's been 12 months or more since you had a period, you have officially reached menopause and you're now postmenopausal. Postmenopause is also a really, really important phase, and we don't talk about that enough because we're living much, much longer into our postmenopausal years. And, previously we wouldn't have even lived to see menopause. And we need to, in that stage, we need to think about supporting our cardiovascular health, our cognitive and brain health, and our bone health. Because if we're not replacing those lost levels of hormones, we're more susceptible to those age-related diseases and health conditions. The average age for reaching menopause in the UK and in Western cultures is around 51, but we also know that lots of people will go through an early menopause, so it might be decades before that. We also have people who will be in chemical menopause, perhaps as a treatment for something like endometriosis or PMDD, and similarly surgical menopause. So if you remove the ovaries, you're going to put someone into a state of menopause, and that transition can happen very, very quickly. So that's different to a natural menopause. Similarly, cancer treatment and certain medical conditions can bring on menopause early. So Kate, I think, mentioned stereotypes and it being this midlife thing. Well, no, it's not. I've got friends in the PMDD community who are now in surgical menopause. They're in their 20s and 30s. And so this can happen at any stage in our reproductive years. So it's not just something that's exclusive to when we get into our 40s, 50s, 60s. And I think that's why it's important for everyone to get educated and be part of the conversation.
And I think because, we have been having that conversation around menopause, we are seeing not just progress in the workplace, but medically as well. I mean, when I first, I have been through that menopause event. I'm only 47, so relatively young. The first time I went to my GP, I was maybe 42, and I've been having the most horrendous night sweats, which I now know are a common symptom. I'm like, what the hell's wrong with me? Because no one's ever talked to me about menopause before. I didn't know necessarily it was a symptom, and I went to my GP, and neither did she. So she wondered if it might be something to do with the fact that I'd started running. It was just, just soldier on again. There was no support there. And it wasn't actually until I started doing this work with Claire on 51 Employers that I really understood that I was clearly perimenopausal. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't actually until I'd reached menopause that I went to the GP and said, well, I'm through it now, so I guess just get on to HRT. It's really important. The health benefits of HRT for your bones, for your heart. It's really important that if you're able to not everybody can have HRT, then try it. I have, and honestly it's been sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it has been life changing. I haven't slept so well since before I had kids, and that in itself has changed my life. When we do start to have these conversations, when we do start to normalise the language and raise awareness of menopause, it impacts all aspects of life, work, school, but also the sort of I think pressure on medical experts to up their knowledge, because it's very reliant on those individuals to improve and keep their medical knowledge and awareness up to speed. The menopause piece has been huge, and it's making a big difference to the women are being taken seriously and being given much better help and support in all aspects of their life. Still a way to go.
Yeah, for sure. I think the conversation's definitely enhanced my knowledge and understanding of what the menopause is.
I think there's a really important and very serious issue around gender equality too. In Jersey, we've just some the gender pay gap statistics have just been released last week, and we still have a 12% gender pay gap in Jersey, and the sort of motherhood penalty is well known, that women around the age of 30, that the earning potential compared to their male colleagues suddenly starts to drop. But there was some really interesting data that really warrants further exploration about women in their early 50s suddenly massively dropping, their salaries hugely declining. So it's a big question: is there a menopause penalty here too? Women are leaving the workplace or reducing their hours or taking a lower grade role because they're struggling with the menopause symptoms, and this has this impacts women financially, and therefore there's an economic issue for the island as well. If you've got women earning less, then there's less tax being paid, more women struggling financially. So there's also there's much bigger issues here. But I find it this issue around gender equality really fascinating. The fact that women have been stereotyped for years, for decades, or since time immemorial, because of their sort of, menstrual cycle, for example, and period pain and other symptoms that they might struggle with. We are stigmatized as human beings. And I think this is such a fundamentally important part of the conversation when we're talking about tackling gender equality. This isn't just about helping a few women out who are getting hot flashes or struggling. This is a part of being a woman, and without having that medical understanding and support available, we are not going to achieve gender equality.
Yeah, I think these issues are just so fundamental to everything we experience as a woman throughout our whole lifespan. All of these issues are just so prevalent, and a lot of them are related to issues of gender equality and oppression, and also to do with our hormones and our daily functioning not being understood by society, our society not being created for women necessarily, being more created for a man.
There's a huge gap medically. Yeah. Still, I was sort of doing a bit of research before this conversation this morning, I was astounded, by some of the statistics. 70% of those experiencing chronic pain are women, but 80% of pain research is conducted on men. That's still the case. There's crazy. So little understanding about how women's bodies work, because it's just not been of interest to the sort of scientific and medical world, and that's shocking.
Females were excluded from clinical trials because our menstrual cycles messed up the data and produced messy results. So even things like when we're taking over-the-counter medication like ibuprofen, paracetamol, aspirin, all of these things, you've got to ask yourself, has this been tested on males and females? And, what are the sex differences in the...
Statistically, it's likely not to have been tested on women, which is frankly quite terrifying. I was reading about, what other sort of countries are doing around these menstrual health issues. And I hadn't realised quite how many countries actually have a statutory paid period leave, or statutory period leave. And Spain last year was sort of famously the first European country to introduce paid leave for people struggling with their periods. And the argument supporting that new statutory right was that, I quote, women are not full citizens without those rights. Quite powerful, isn't it? It's really, really important that women have the right to receive, the proper medical support and treatment and understanding in their workplace for menstrual health issues, and that just isn't the case currently.
Thank you for raising that. I think it's such an interesting conversation surrounding period leave and how that fits into the conversation around Jersey. Claire, I wonder if you could explain to me what period leave would mean in practice and what benefits to women it would have and what maybe challenges they might face if this was brought into place.
Well, unpopular opinion, I don't actually support menstrual leave.
Me neither. I agree, Claire.
I because of the unintended consequences that can happen, and because if we think about it on a really practical level and the logistics, so you introduce a policy that says people with periods can have a paid day off on the first day of their period if they're in pain, and that's usually how these things go. Well, what does that mean for me as someone with PMDD who is potentially incapacitated, probably the wrong word, impaired for more than a day, and my symptoms aren't physical pain, mine are psychological symptoms. So where do I fit within that policy, and what is my kind of entitlement, if you like, as someone with a medical condition? And I think we've got to be really careful about recognizing the difference between medical conditions that are, menstrual issues and general experiences that might not actually require a paid day off. It might be a preference, but there's a difference between a need, a medical need, and a preference. There's also something around disclosure and how do you access this leave if you are wanting to take it. Are you then forced to tell your employer, well, I'm on my period and so I'm going to I need this as paid leave? Like, there's just so many questions, and I think the risk is it weakens our position as women, females, because an employer might go, well, no, I've got to pay them one day off a month and they're not going to be working. When actually, many of us, if we're able to work flexibly and work from home and work in a way that is comfortable for us, we don't need a special policy for menstrual issues. And where does that leave people with diabetes, people with irritable bowel syndrome, people with depression, people, where do we stop? So I think the best approach is flexibility for everyone, and that is truly equitable, isn't it? No matter what you've got going on in life, and we've all got stuff that happens and crops up, life, and that I think is a much better approach. However, I do think there is still a real need for the awareness, the education, the manager training, and everything else we've talked about. But in terms of policy, no. Call it well-being days. Give everyone an entitlement. If you can take 10 well-being days a month or duvet days, whatever you want to call them, but don't label them menstrual or period leave days or whatever, because I think it's detrimental actually from a gender equity point of view.
You explained that perfectly. Kate, I can see your head nodding away.
No, I completely agree with everything that Claire is saying. And interestingly, it's too early to assess how well the sort of Spanish legislation is working out. But certainly in some of the other countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Zambia, Indonesia, I think a lot of the sort of evidence is suggesting it's actually having a detrimental effect for women in the workplace because they are being stigmatized. So therefore, culturally, they're not actually asking for the leave anyway because they feel they can't or that they will be. So until culturally we're in a place where you're not going to be stigmatized, it's really not going to change much, and it's potentially actually going to be detrimental. But I agree with Claire. You need a much more inclusive approach. do you have a policy for fertility, for menopause? But do you have all? What about men who are struggling with different mental and physical health issues as well? So I actually think there's a much bigger question to be asked about our approach to sick leave more generally. I think many of our approaches to managing sick leave are pretty archaic, to be honest. And there's this sort of concern that if you give people too much paid statutory, too much paid sick leave, they're going to abuse that and they're going to take their full entitlement. Actually, the evidence suggests that those organisations with more generous and those countries with more generous sick leave and pay have a much better and a much lower absence rate in their organisations, probably because they've got a much better culture. Really, do you want to be forcing people back into work when they're not able to perform well? If you're talking about sort of other physical contagious illnesses, and we've had our recent experience, haven't we, with COVID, do you really want those people in the work? So I think there's a more fundamental question around how we manage sickness absence, and those with medical conditions relating to their menstrual health should benefit from a more considered and probably more generous approach to sick pay and absence, and at the same time others who are struggling for a multitude of medical reasons will benefit too. So I agree with Claire, and I think we should be looking at our statutory sick pay and leave. I mean, our friends in Guernsey don't have a legal entitlement to statutory sick leave. That's interesting. Of course, many organisations, go beyond the statutory and consider how they can support their employees in terms of their health and well-being in a much more progressive way. Mm-hmm. And that's to be encouraged.
I was just going to say, it's really interesting when we take that back to the workplace gender gap and the societal gender gap. When we know that women are much more likely to experience things like autoimmune disease and chronic health conditions, and yet we have this uniform approach to sickness absence and sickness absence management, and if the playing field is unequal, and we're looking at everyone the same, they've got the same entitlement, but we know that this group has a vulnerability, it just, as Kate said, it poses so many questions about the way we approach things. And I think it's a case of, it's because it's always been done this way. We've always done it like this, and so let's continue. And get rid of sickness absence triggers and all of that rubbish. That's why do we? And Kate, you mentioned a friend in school who got into trouble for being absent. That's when it starts, but we reward people for 100% presence, attendance. Yes. That's the word I was looking for. Attendance.
Yes.
And that's not possible for so many of us. And yet that continues when we get into the workplace. We penalise people if they need to take time off to prioritise their health. Yeah. It's bonkers. Everything we know about well-being, it's nuts.
Yeah. It amazes, and I think that's at the root of so many of these exclusive cultures rather than inclusive. We start from this place of distrust. You can't be this ill, you can't have it, you must be lying or you must be abusing the system. It's shocking. And all the evidence is there to support, the more inclusive an approach we have, the more flexibility we have, the more generous we are with how we treat people who are ill. The better retention rates, our productivity is higher, our absence rates are lower. And those with the more sort of draconian approach, 3 strikes and you're on a disciplinary, don't retain their good people, or their people stay and become more ill and less productive. Mm-hmm. I think we're looking at it all wrong.
Or they end up with an employment tribunal on their hands, and about £26,000 to settle a discrimination case. So
not here in Jersey, Claire. Yes, the tribunals are much less generous in Jersey, which is another question, and that's actually up for being discussed at the moment. It's a different situation here when it comes to tribunal. We have a big culture of compromise agreements and NDAs as well. So many of the discrimination issues don't even reach tribunal, which means that employers are not learning from repeating the same mistakes that lead to these discrimination claims and NDAs and exiting people. And we know the cost of recruitment is so high, and it's so challenging to recruit people at the moment. Why would you not be wanting to improve the way you retain, your good people? But interesting.
Well, that's all so interesting. Going back to the period leave, I wasn't really sure where I sat with it. I feel like I had sort of a sense of unease and that it might lead to like a backlash, or, women wouldn't feel comfortable, or that there were better ways, in the sense of creating a more flexible work culture, as you were saying, where, you have capacity to work from home, whether that be, I don't know, if you've got some sort of medical condition or mental health condition, or it's something to do with menstrual symptoms. There's just so many things that being flexible is so important. As you say, educating, raising awareness and addressing the stigma and creating a change in culture, I think, is the way to address it.
Yeah. Well, I understand the rationale for the period leave, sort of in terms of normalising, period pain as a health condition, removing that stigma, trying to give women more rights in the workplace. But until culturally, we're able to actually have those conversations, and for women not to be stigmatised as a result of saying I need time off because of my period, it's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm. And how do we drive cultural change? Is it having more conversations? What do you think is the best way to sort of drive this from the bottom up?
I think we're in the midst of a real menstrual movement at the moment, which is fantastic. Off the back of the menopause movement that was driven, as Kate mentioned before, by some really pivotal celebrities who've driven that forwards. But in terms of what we can do in our organisations, I think it's starting the conversation, whatever that looks like. If you've got a women's network or an ERG, start the conversation. Ask people about their experiences. Storytelling is a huge part of this, and giving people the opportunity to talk and to connect and seek that really powerful peer support. Manager training, I think, is a huge one to equip people with the knowledge and the vocabulary and the confidence. What we don't want to do is get these conversations going, but not empower our managers with the things they need to be able to support people. And I think it's really unfair if we don't do that and we expect them to be able to navigate those waters without any kind of direction or support. And then, there's lots of things. Kate?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Claire said. Starting the conversation, but I think investing in your people managers. Yeah. So, and this is what excited me about the 51 employers pledge, that it wouldn't just help perimenopausal and menopausal women. It would help any employee that is struggling, because it helps you to give your line managers the skills they need to create, inclusive team cultures, an environment where people can say, you know what, I'm really struggling. I'm finding this hard. I need some help. I need some flexibility, and to be able to spot the signs and have that sensitive conversation when someone is not themselves. As I say, that stretches way beyond, menopause. Mm-hmm. It will help any employee, whether they have another health issue, mental health, problems at home, going through a horrible divorce, for whatever reason that they are struggling or not themselves, it means that they're in an environment where they're not going to be judged. There's not going to be assumptions made about what's wrong with them, or they're no longer a good performer. Line managers are equipped to help them before it becomes a irreparable issue for that person in their workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And on culture, one thing that I've been thinking about recently is if it's really hard to talk about these personal, sensitive topics, is that a symptom of something, a bigger problem culturally? If we talk about things like psychological safety, people feeling safe to open up, to be vulnerable, to take risks without consequence, without repercussions, without backlash. Really, menstrual health, it's part of being able to be your authentic self, isn't it? And if you can't do that, what does that say about your culture? And I'd be really holding a mirror up and thinking, well, people, they can't be themselves here. We've got this real tampon up the sleeve culture where no one can ask for help. Everyone's burning out because they're so afraid to say, hey, I'm struggling, I'm drowning here. And so that, I think it can also be a symptom of a much bigger issue that might be going on.
Yeah. And it's not just an issue for employers either. I mean, the good news in Jersey is that we have now got a sort of public conversation about periods in the context of period poverty, actually. So the government has been putting free period products in public spaces, and there's been some debate over whether they're approaching it in the right way. But I think that's a really good move. And the fact that they're doing it has created this conversation about people are talking about period, not in whispered tones. They're talking about periods, and specifically period poverty, which is another issue in itself. I think we are referring to what Claire said earlier. There's a movement. I think there is a movement, and we're beginning to see that in Jersey. So it means employers, it means governments, it means GPs, all really beginning to improve their knowledge and their understanding around the issues, and then consider the solutions. But the 51 employers pledge is a good place to start. I think you can easily translate it more broadly to menstrual health issues in addition to menopause.
Thank you so much, both of you. You are so informed about this topic, and I've just found it absolutely fascinating hearing from you. You've spoken so well about all of these topics, and please, can we do a part 2? Because I feel like we all have so much more to say about this topic. We've been almost talking for an hour and a half, and I feel like we've covered so much, but we could speak for another 4 hours, I'm sure, about these issues. They're so important.
Another interesting one might be fertility, and especially in the context of an ageing population, which is something that Jersey's talking about a lot at the moment, and there is some work going on locally around that too. So that might be an interesting one.
Yeah, for sure. There's so much. I absolutely love talking about this sort of thing, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this special episode of Bailiwick Podcasts for International Women's Day. For more on that, and for more female-focused stories, visit bailiwickexpress.com.